There comes a moment when continuing to try to save a relationship begins to destroy the very person you are trying to save, yourself. And perhaps no one has ever told you this, because for a long time you learned exactly the opposite. You learned that if someone was pulling away, you should move closer. If they took too long to reply, you should show more interest. If they seemed cold, you should offer more affection. If they started forgetting you, you should do something to make yourself remembered. But there comes a point when love stops being presence and begins to turn into pursuit. And there is an even more uncomfortable truth that we are going to discover in this video. Perhaps this person's absence is not the biggest problem you are facing right now. Perhaps the real danger is what you are losing within yourself while desperately trying not to lose someone. Think about it. How many times have you looked at your phone waiting for a message? How many times have you written something, deleted it, written it again, and tried to find the perfect words to regain attention that once came naturally? Maybe you have already felt this. That strange feeling of realizing that you are doing more and more while the other person is doing less and less. You offer presence, they offer distance. You try to understand, they remain indifferent. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to negotiate something that should never be placed on a negotiating table, your peace. But there is something about silence that almost no one understands. And before the end of this video, you will understand why stopping your pursuit of someone can reveal a truth that no conversation, no message, and no attempt at persuasion could ever reveal. Today, we are going to explore 7 Stoic and Christian truths about what happens when you stop chasing someone who has decided to walk away. And pay very close attention to the last one, because it completely changes the question. You may begin this video wanting to discover how to make someone miss you and end up realizing that this was never the most important question. So I want to ask you something. At what point does fighting for someone stop being love and start becoming self-abandonment? Hold on to that question, because perhaps your answer will be different by the time we reach the end. The first truth is this. The more desperately you try to control distance, the more that distance begins to control you. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around a simple distinction. Some things are within our control, others are not. You can control your intention. You can control your response. You can control whether you are going to send that message for the 10th time. You can control what you will do with your morning after waking up missing someone. But you cannot control another person's heart. You cannot control when they reply. You cannot control whether they recognize your worth. You cannot control whether they come back. And this is where one of the quietest forms of suffering begins, trying to exercise authority over something God never placed under our command. When you insist on controlling someone's reaction, you hand that person control over your peace. One message changes your day. One silence destroys your night. A message seen without a reply triggers dozens of thoughts. A social media post turns into an investigation, and then you call it love. But often, it is anxiety trying to find security in another human being. Psychology describes something similar in anxious attachment patterns. When faced with the perception that someone is pulling away, some people intensify their search for closeness and reassurance. The problem is that this attempt to relieve anxiety can fuel the cycle of insecurity even further. But here is the detail that changes everything. Stoicism would say, return to what is within your control. Christian faith would add something even greater. Surrender to God what never was. Proverbs 4:23 instructs us to guard our hearts because everything we do flows from them. Guarding your heart does not mean building a wall. It does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean punishing someone with silence. It means stopping the habit of placing your emotional stability in the hands of someone who never promised to carry it. And this brings us to the second truth. Your absence only has value when it is not a strategy designed to provoke a reaction. This point is crucial, Because someone might hear all of this and think, then I'll disappear so this person will become afraid of losing me. No, that would still be dependence, just wearing different clothes. If you stay silent while constantly looking at your phone to see whether it worked, you have not emotionally withdrawn. You are still trapped. If you start taking care of yourself only to make someone jealous, you are still living for the other person. If you post about being happy while secretly hoping that one particular person sees it, your life is still being directed by an audience of one. True silence begins when you do not need it to produce an effect on the other person. It needs to produce transformation in you, and that difference is enormous. Because silence used as manipulation asks, will they come back now? But silence born from dignity asks, why was I willing to lose myself to keep someone from leaving? And this is where our conversation begins to go deeper. Because perhaps you are thinking about one specific person right now. Perhaps a name immediately appeared in your mind. Perhaps you are still waiting for that message. And there is no shame in missing someone. Feeling is human. The problem begins when longing becomes permission to accept what wounds your dignity. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to return to his own character in the face of other people's actions. He could not control their behavior, but he could decide who he would be in response. Christianity takes this reflection even deeper. Your worth does not begin when someone chooses you, and it does not end when someone stops choosing you either. There is an identity that comes before human approval, and perhaps that is exactly what this distance is about to teach you. But there is a third truth, one that is much harder, because it explains why some people only realize what they had after access to it is no longer guaranteed. And to understand it, we need to follow the story of someone who believed he was fighting for love, when, in reality, he was slowly disappearing from his own life. What happened next completely changed the way he understood absence, love, and God. And perhaps it will change yours too. The third truth begins exactly where many people lose themselves. Sometimes you do not only miss someone, you miss the hope of finally being chosen by that person. It took Daniel a long time to realize this. For almost 2 years, he lived in a relationship that always seemed to be one conversation away from finally working out. At first, there was reciprocity. Morning messages, long phone calls, plans for the future, small gestures that made Daniel believe he had found someone with whom he could build something real. But slowly, something changed. Replies began taking longer. Seeing each other began to depend almost entirely on his initiative. Whenever he felt distance, Daniel did what he believed love required. He tried to compensate for it with more presence. He sent another message. He asked if everything was okay. He tried to be understanding. He made excuses for behaviors that deep down were already hurting him. She's busy. Maybe she's going through something. I need to be patient. And some of those explanations might even have been true. The problem was not understanding someone. The problem was that Daniel had begun using understanding to justify abandoning himself. There were nights when he would put his phone on the table and promise, "I'm not going to send anything tonight." 15 minutes later, he would pick it up again. An hour later, he would check whether she was online. Then he would go on social media. And all it took was seeing her active for that painful question to arise. If she has time to be here, why doesn't she have time to talk to me? Then the inner negotiation would begin. Maybe just a simple message, nothing emotional. Just asking how her day went. He would send it and wait. His phone had become a kind of thermometer for his own worth. When she replied affectionately, he could breathe. When she replied coldly, he questioned everything. When she did not reply, his mind created dozens of stories. But there was something Daniel still had not realized. He believed he was trying to get that woman back. In reality, he was trying to get back the feeling he had when he felt desired by her. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. One night, after another strange conversation, she told him she needed space. Daniel immediately felt that old impulse. He wanted to ask, How much space? He wanted to know why. He wanted to find out if there was someone else. He wanted to explain everything he felt. He wrote a huge message, read it, deleted it, wrote it again. And then something seemingly insignificant happened. His father called. Daniel almost did not answer. But he did. They talked about simple things, work, family, a doctor's appointment, a problem with the car, until his father asked, "Son, are you okay?" Daniel automatically replied, "I am." There were a few seconds of silence. Then his father said, "You've been saying you're okay for a long time now," with the voice of someone trying to convince himself. That hit him. After the call, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The phone was still on the table. The message was still open. But for the first time that night, he did not think about her. He thought about himself. He looked around. There were books he never finished. His guitar had been sitting untouched for months. He had stopped working out. He barely saw his friends anymore. His spiritual life had been reduced to desperate prayers, asking God to make that relationship work. And that was the moment everything began to change. Daniel realized something terrible. He had asked that person so many times not to abandon him that he failed to realize he was already abandoning himself. That was the revelation. He closed the message. He did not block anyone. He did not post passive-aggressive messages. He did not decide to disappear to make her miss him. He did not create a strategy to make her come back. He simply did not send it. The next morning, he woke up still missing her. And this is important. Because true transformation rarely happens the way it does in movies. You do not learn a truth at night and wake up healed in the morning. Daniel still wanted to look at his phone. He still wondered whether she would write. He still felt anxious. But now there was a new question. What is within my control right now? That deeply stoic question began to reorganize his days. That morning, the answer was simple. Get up, take a shower, work, eat lunch without checking his phone 10 times. Go for a walk in the evening. Before going to sleep, pray without asking God to control another person's heart. For the first time, his prayer was different. God, if I cannot control what is happening, teach me not to lose who I am supposed to be because of it. During the first few days, nothing extraordinary happened. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. She did not come running back. There was no cinematic message. There was no instant regret. There was silence. And Daniel had to discover who he was within that silence. The fourth truth was beginning to emerge. When you stop filling every empty space with anxiety, the emptiness begins to reveal things. He realized how much of his routine had been organized around the expectation of receiving attention. He started working out again. He reconnected with some friends. He began reading again. But most importantly, he recovered a habit he had neglected. Every morning, before touching his phone, he spent a few minutes in prayer, not to ask her to come back, to ask for direction. Weeks passed, and then came the message that, sometime earlier, would have made his heart race. You disappeared. Is everything okay? Daniel looked at those words. Months earlier, he would have replied immediately. Maybe he would have used that opening to pour out everything he had been feeling. But now something had changed. He realized that the most important question was not, does she miss me? It was, who did I become while waiting for someone to miss me? That question hurt, because Daniel finally understood that he had spent months measuring his worth by his ability to remain necessary to another person, and in that moment he saw the mistake. His silence had not been powerful because it made someone reach out to him. His silence had been powerful because it finally allowed him to hear what his anxiety had been drowning out. He was tired. He was hurt. He was trying to control something that had never been under his control, and he needed to come home, not to an address, but to himself and to God. Daniel replied hours later, politely and calmly. No revenge, no games, no rehearsed coldness. They talked, but now there was one fundamental difference. He was not trying to convince anyone to choose him. And precisely because of that, he was able to see that relationship with a clarity he had never possessed before. He recognized behaviors he had romanticized, boundaries he had ignored, needs he had never properly communicated. He also acknowledged his own mistakes, the anxiety, the insistence, the attempt to turn affection into a guarantee. But the real lesson was still to come, because Daniel would discover that the goal of reclaiming his life should never be to make someone regret losing him. There is something much greater than that. Jesus asked in Mark 8:36, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" Now bring that question into relationships. What good is it to get the message, to get the attention, to get someone to come back, if, in order to do so, you had to abandon your peace, your principles, your dignity, and your relationship with God? Perhaps you are waiting for someone to feel your absence at this very moment. But there is a possibility we have not yet considered. Perhaps God is using this absence to show you what was absent from your own life. And that brings us to the fifth truth, because there is an enormous difference between someone who simply stops chasing and someone who finally understands why they were running. When you understand that difference, silence stops being a technique, absence stops being a game, and detachment stops meaning coldness. That is exactly where Stoicism and Christian faith begin to reveal two parts of the same inner battle. One explains why your mind desperately tries to regain control. The other reveals in whom your trust should rest when control ends. The fifth truth is probably the hardest to accept. Often, you are not suffering only because someone pulled away. You are suffering because you lost the sense of control over what that person feels about you. And that difference changes everything. When Daniel finally stopped chasing her, he realized that for months he had been silently asking, "How do I make her feel about me the way she used to?" Notice what is hidden inside that question. Control. What do I do? What do I say? How long should I wait? Should I disappear? Should I reply? Should I show that I'm doing well? There is a constant attempt to find the perfect move that will produce a specific reaction in the other person. And perhaps you are doing exactly that without realizing it. You call it longing. But part of that anguish may be your mind trying to regain a certainty it has lost. This is where Epictetus becomes so relevant. One of the foundations of Stoic thought is separating what depends on us from what does not. Your choices belong to you. Your character belongs to you. Your discipline belongs to you. The decision to establish a boundary belongs to you. But another person's longing does not. Their regret does not. Their recognition does not. Their decision to come back does not either. And trying to control these things is like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the more it slips away. But here is the part that Stoicism alone does not intend to answer in the same way Christian faith does. If I do not control everything, in whom do I place what I cannot control? For the Christian, the answer is not chance. It is God. Philippians 4:6-7 teaches us not to live dominated by anxiety, but to present our needs to God in prayer, and it speaks of a peace that guards the heart and mind. Notice the order. The promise is not, present everything to God, and He will make that person send you a message. No, the promise points first to what happens inside you. Peace. This is the point where Stoicism and Christian faith can enter into dialogue without becoming confused with one another. Stoicism teaches your mind to recognize the limits of control. Faith teaches your heart to trust God beyond those limits. And perhaps that is exactly where you were going wrong. You were trying to get from a person something no person should have to carry, responsibility for your peace. But there is still another layer. The sixth truth is this: true absence does not happen when you disappear from someone's life. It happens when you stop disappearing from your own life. Read that again within yourself. Maybe you put projects on hold because of someone. Maybe you neglected friendships. Maybe your concentration at work declined. Maybe you woke up and, before even thanking God for another day, looked for a notification. Maybe you have spent weeks saying you need to start working out again, studying, reading, praying, or taking care of some area of your life. But you keep waiting to resolve that emotional situation first. This is how a person begins to disappear from their own existence. It does not happen all at once. It happens through small concessions. I can't do it today. When this gets resolved, I'll go back. When she replies, I'll be okay. When I find out what happened, I'll be able to move on. Except your life remains suspended, waiting for an answer that may never come. And that needs to end. Not to make anyone miss you, to reclaim what God placed under your responsibility, your life. Marcus Aurelius wrote his reflections to remind himself to return to the duty of the present moment, not to what someone thought of him, not to other people's behavior, to what needed to be done right in front of him. This idea has extraordinary practical power because anxiety lives in what if, discipline lives in what do I do now. What if she never comes back? You cannot control that. What do I do now? Get up. What if she's with someone else? You cannot control that. What do I do now? Take care of what is in front of you. What if she realizes she lost me? You cannot control that. What do I do now? Protect your character. Pray, work, train, keep your word. Go back to your family, go to bed on time, do what your anxiety has been making you postpone. It sounds simple, but this change begins to rebuild a person. And now we reach the point I promised from the beginning. Perhaps you started this video wanting to discover the secret to making someone miss you. Perhaps you imagined it would be silence, distance, indifference, some hidden psychological principle. But the great secret is far more uncomfortable. You need to stop organizing your life around the hope of being missed by someone who decided to walk away. Because as long as your transformation depends on the other person noticing your transformation, you are still not free. As long as you work out so they will notice, you are still trapped. As long as you grow in order to provoke regret, you are still trapped. As long as you stay silent waiting for a message, you are still trapped. You have merely changed the shape of the chain. And that is why true silence is so different. True silence does not say, now you're going to discover what you lost. It says, I finally discovered what I was losing within myself. And this is where everything changes. Because when you reclaim your routine, your principles, your communion with God, and your ability to be at peace without an answer, one consequence may occur. Some people really will notice your absence. Some will come back. Others will not. But neither possibility defines your direction anymore. That is the paradox. When you stop living your life trying to be unforgettable to someone, you begin to build a life that does not need anyone's memory in order to have meaning. But the seventh truth is still missing, and it is the most important of all, because there is a question that arises when someone finally comes back. Imagine that after weeks or months, your phone lights up, the name appears. The message you imagined so many times has finally arrived. I've been thinking about you. What would you do? Would you reply immediately? Would you interpret it as a sign from God? Would you forget everything that happened? Would you go back to the same place simply because you finally received what you wanted? This is where many people lose all the progress they have made, because learning to endure absence is only half of the transformation. The other half is learning not to confuse return with change. Someone missing you does not mean they have learned to value you. Someone reaching out to you does not mean they are ready to treat you differently. Longing is a feeling. Change is behavior. And wisdom requires knowing how to distinguish between the two. Jesus taught an extremely simple principle in Matthew 7:16. By their fruit you will recognize them, not only by their words, by their fruit. So if someone comes back, you do not need to punish them. You do not need to play games. You do not need to act superior. But you also do not need to give them full access again, simply because you heard the words you had been waiting for. Look at the fruit. Is there accountability? Is there respect? Is there consistent change? Is there reciprocity? Or is it merely loneliness reaching again for what used to be available? That question protects you from turning forgiveness into repetition. Because Christian faith does not mean having no boundaries, and Stoic self-control does not mean having no love. You can forgive without returning to the same dynamic. You can love someone and recognize that you should not remain in that relationship. You can wish someone well and keep your distance. You can also rebuild something when there is truth, repentance, and genuine change. But there is one decision you can no longer make. You cannot go back to abandoning yourself just to keep someone from abandoning you. And in the next section, we are going to turn all of this into action. Not theory, not beautiful phrases, concrete actions. You are going to discover 3 practices you can begin today to break this cycle, regain your emotional stability, and put your peace back where it belongs. And at the end, I want you to return to the question I asked at the beginning. At what point does fighting for someone stop being love and start becoming self-abandonment? Because perhaps now you are already beginning to see the answer. But there is an even deeper question. If God removed today the possibility of that person ever coming back, what would remain of the life you built while waiting for them? Do not answer quickly. Because perhaps hidden inside that answer is exactly the part of you that needs to be rebuilt. The 7th truth is this: you do not need to learn how to become unforgettable to someone. You need to learn not to forget who you are when someone stops choosing you. Because after everything we have seen, the most important moment arrives. The moment to act, not to make someone miss you, not to provoke regret, not to prove that you can live without that person, but to reclaim what you may have slowly given away: your peace, your direction, and your ability to live without emotionally depending on an answer. And there are 3 practical actions you can begin today. The first action is to interrupt the behavior that feeds your anxiety. What should you do? Create distance from whatever keeps you emotionally trapped. Maybe it is constantly checking whether the person is online, revisiting old conversations, going to their profile, inventing reasons to send a message, asking friends what they are doing. You do not need to turn this into a war. Simply interrupt the cycle. Why does this work? Because every time you look for a small sign of attention to relieve your anxiety, you may end up teaching your mind to seek that relief again. It is a simple cycle. Anxiety, checking, temporary relief, new anxiety. So do something concrete. For the next 24 hours, whenever you feel the urge to check, send a message, or look for information, wait 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, do something else. Walk, pray, read, work, breathe, and write down what you are feeling. Do not ask, how do I make this person think about me? Ask, what am I trying not to feel when I rush to look for this person? Maybe it is loneliness, maybe rejection, maybe fear, maybe the feeling that you are not enough. That is where healing begins. The second action is to rebuild a routine that does not emotionally depend on anyone. Take a sheet of paper and write down 3 areas you neglected while you were trapped in this situation: your body, work, family, friendships, sleep, study, spiritual life. Choose 3, then establish 1 small action for each one. Do not say, I'm going to completely change my life. Say, today I will walk for 30 minutes. Today I will call someone I love. Today I will spend the first 10 minutes of my morning with God before touching my phone. Why does this work? Because your mind needs to relearn that your life continues to produce meaning, even when a certain person is not part of it. Marcus Aurelius constantly brought his attention back to the duty of the present moment, not the perfect scenario. the next duty, and there is enormous wisdom in that. You do not need to solve your entire life today. You simply need to stop abandoning it today. The third action is to give back to God what you are trying to control. And perhaps this is the hardest one, because we can say, "I gave it to God," while secretly continuing to try to determine the outcome. Surrender does not mean saying, "God, make this person come back." It can mean saying, "God, I would like her to come back. But above what I want what you know I need." There is vulnerability in that prayer, because now you admit that perhaps God's answer will not be the one you imagined. Proverbs 3:5 calls us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and not rely solely on our own understanding. Sometimes you will not understand why someone left. Maybe you will never receive the perfect explanation. But closure does not always come when another person finally explains everything. Sometimes closure comes when you realize that you no longer need that explanation in order to keep living. Now, I want you to do something different. For a few seconds, stop thinking about the person who came to mind during this video. Think about yourself. Think about how many times you stared at a screen waiting to be chosen. How many times you minimized your needs so you would not seem difficult. How many times you accepted crumbs because you were afraid of losing even those crumbs. How many times you confused anxiety with love. How many times you asked God to restore a relationship while perhaps He was trying to restore you. And now imagine that you could go back to that version of yourself, that person sitting there at night looking at the phone. What would you say? Perhaps you would not say, "She will come back," because you do not know. Perhaps you would say, "Get up, your life did not end here." And perhaps that is what you needed to hear today. You do not need to hate the person who left. You do not need to wish for that person to suffer. You do not need to prove anything. You can simply accept that what is not under your control will no longer have the right to control what is. Your peace, your character, your decisions, your walk with God. Remember the question from the beginning. At what point does fighting for someone stop being love and start becoming self-abandonment? Perhaps now you know. It is when, in order to keep someone close, you have to keep moving farther away from who you are supposed to be. So here is my challenge for you. For the next 7 days, do absolutely nothing with the goal of provoking a reaction from that person. No passive-aggressive posts, no calculated messages, no disappearing while hoping they will come looking for you. Use these 7 days to return to your life. Pray, work, take care of your body, reach out to people who truly love you, and observe what happens inside you when you stop living while waiting for a reaction. Maybe that person will miss you, maybe they will not. But after this video, you already know. That was never the greatest victory. The greatest victory is reaching the point where someone's absence no longer means your own absence from yourself. If this message made you see something you needed to change, write a simple sentence in the comments. "I will not abandon myself anymore." And if you want, also tell me where you are listening to this video from. It is always special to discover how far these messages are reaching and how many hearts are being touched. Now I want to leave you with a question that deserves a truthful answer. What were you sacrificing within yourself just to keep being chosen by someone? Think before you answer. Perhaps your answer will help someone else who is going through this exact battle. And if this reflection brought you clarity, like the video, so it can reach someone else who is also trying to regain their peace. Subscribe so we can continue exploring together what Stoicism teaches us about the mind and what faith reveals to us about purpose, trust, and God. And when silence comes again, remember, perhaps it is not asking who misses you. Perhaps it is asking whether you have finally learned to return to yourself without walking away from God.